Risa, you can
Okay,
start your
that's better,
presentation.
yeah, and I'm not getting the feedback anymore. All right, so I'm going to get right into my talk. I only have half an hour, so I can't tell you everything, but I'll do the best I can. This is really my outline. I'm going to give you a little bit of the context. Then I'll talk about climate change mitigation in protected areas, then climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. I have a lot of case studies. I don't think I'll have enough time to talk about all the case studies, but they'll be in the presentation for you to look at afterwards, and then future directions for our group. I start with this cartoon where you have COVID-19. I notice everybody who's there is wearing masks, and we're all dealing with this very serious pandemic. Is there a problem? Hello? This cartoon was brought to my attention by a minister, and it really struck her because we are right in the middle of a pandemic. And of course, it's really the key thing we're all thinking about. But some of the other issues, like economic issues and climate change, are actually overriding and even bigger than this pandemic are. And biodiversity collapse is kind of central to it all. So without biodiversity, we can't even address climate change. I then bring your attention to this report that just came out last week, and it's a joint report by IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's remarkable in itself that those two organizations have been able to come up with a joint report, and the take-home message from this is simple, that we have a climate and nature crisis, and we either solve both or we solve neither. So I highly recommend that all of you look at this. Central to solving both is in fact protected areas. To start, I just want to remind you a little bit about the carbon cycle, because we forget sometimes. Carbon moves around. Some of you might have seen this diagram before. It's from NASA, and it's about carbon flux. And what it tells you is that on the terrestrial side on the right, where you see the plants, you get about 450 billion tons of CO2 absorbed each year. At the same time, those same terrestrial systems release carbon. They release about 440 billion tons. So that's a net of about 10 billion tons that they take out of the atmosphere. And the oceans, it's the same. They sequester carbon, about 340 billion tons, and they also respire, let off about 330 billion tons. And so the net of that is that you've got the oceans taking in about an extra 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide. That's a little bit less than half of what we are putting out as a globe of industrial CO2 emissions. So that's the part about, I like to call that catch. That's the part of sequestering carbon. But really the bigger story is this. It's the stored carbon, which is much bigger than just the fluxes of sequestration. So you can see on the plant side, in the above ground biomass, you get about 550 billion tons of CO2 is stored in the plant above ground systems. In the soil, it's much more, it's 4 times that. About 2,300 billion tons of CO2 is stored in the soil. On the ocean side, it's even more remarkable. You have about 1,000 billion tons of CO2 is stored in the surface systems, and about 37 billion tons of CO2 in the deep ocean. And this is very important because when we talk about protected areas, and we talk about catch and store, it's often hard for people to understand that, yes, it's important to have ecosystems sequestering carbon, but it's also important to keep all that stored carbon in storage. And so by not disturbing natural systems, then you ensure that that carbon is kept in storage. And this graph is just a little bit finer detail, looking at how important oceans, forests, and some of the different ecosystems are. Blue carbon, that's the coastal ecosystems. It's also important. particularly important on a per hectare basis, but of course there's so much more forest and so much more deep ocean just in area wise, and that's why they overwhelm the sequestration. As far as storage goes, this graph on the left shows you how much carbon is stored in some global ecosystems. You've got the boreal forests, and this is all in billions of tons. Tropical forests and temperate forests. And then you've got peatlands, grasslands, and I could have added wetlands to this as well. On the right, you have the blue carbon systems, and note that the scale on the graph for the blue carbon systems is much less, 2 orders of magnitude lower than the scale for the terrestrial systems. And salt marshes, there's a lot of debate about just how much carbon is stored in salt marshes. It probably depends on where they are, the type of salt marsh, the disturbances, but you've got a range there. Mangroves and seagrasses, these are all very important for carbon storage. The Protected Areas Climate Change Specialist Group, in 2016, we put out a guidelines for protected area managers on adapting to climate change. And we're hoping to do one on mitigation, as Kathy said in her introduction, and hoping to do this in partnership with KNP actually, and others. And on the right, I have some relevant publications that we just put out. This map shows you how the world is thinking about protected areas in terms of climate change. So the colors in the dark green are countries that have included protected areas as part of their nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement. This is, these are the agreements that every country comes up with a nationally determined contribution, and these are supposed to be ratcheted up year by year. And you'll notice 37% of the countries identify protected areas as a means of attaining their adaptation and mitigation targets. And at this point, none of these are developed countries. Half of these intend to add new protected areas or expand different ones. And 47% of the countries made no mention of protected areas. So there's a lot of room for improvement in this area. Less than 20% of the countries with blue carbon ecosystems included coastal wetlands as part of their nationally determined contribution. So this is an emerging issue, and this role of protected areas is just starting to be talked about on the global level in all countries. This next slide just gives you a bit of a sense of the type of ecosystems we're talking about that are so important for catching and storing carbon. This is on the terrestrial side. This is a tropical forest. Most of the carbon here is above ground. The boreal forest, most of the carbon here is below ground. This is a temperate rainforest where I live. And in this case, most of it is also above ground. This is a picture over here of the Amazon basin, where most of the carbon is above ground, and natural peatlands. And of course, this is a natural peatland in northern Canada, but there's natural peatland forests in Indonesia and in the Congo Basin that are very important. The middle picture here is a savanna. Grasslands and savanna are very important for carbon storage. So you might not realize how much carbon is in the soils of those systems, and when they're disturbed, that carbon ends up in the atmosphere. And the last picture is of wetlands. This looks at the blue carbon systems. So the first 2 pictures on the left are mangrove forests, and very important for carbon sequestration. The next 2 slides are eelgrass, and the last 2 are different types of tidal marshes, also very important for carbon storage and sequestration. So now what people are talking about now is the importance of thinking about adding to our arsenal for protected areas and thinking about starting to protect those areas that are carbon dense, have a lot of carbon stored in them and sequester a lot of carbon, that overlap with high biodiversity areas. And as probably everybody here knows, it's often very difficult to quantify the biodiversity side of that. So what this map shows you is something that the authors call the Proactive Biodiversity Index. So it overlays carbon density over areas that are, in terms of biodiversity, intact, irreplaceable, and have good habitat conditions and a natural assemblage of species. So these are not the at-risk places, but these are the places that are intact and very unique for their biodiversity. The darker the brown, and you look at the scale here, so the darkest brown is very important for biodiversity and carbon density. And then the yellow areas, they don't have an overlap. And some of them, like a dark blue area, very important for biodiversity, but not as carbon dense. And I put a little circle here for Korea, just to see where you fit in. And you can see that Korea's, and again, this is a scale, this is like a global scale. So obviously, when you look in a finer scale in any country, you'll find pockets probably of carbon dense, high biodiversity areas. Only 12% of the hotspots for proactive biodiversity and carbon density are currently protected. And these are some of the places that there's a lot of potential for what they're now calling climate biodiversity reserves. This is another map that's sort of another take on the biodiversity side of it. So it overlays carbon density with areas that have irreplaceable biodiversity that's threatened. And so you can see now the darker areas have changed a bit. Really, this whole area here in Southeast Asia is highlighted. You've got parts of South America, Central America, parts of North America, and parts of Russia and Africa that show up important in this. About 21% of the hotspots for, they're calling this the reactive biodiversity index, are formally protected. This graph looks at, it's a new paper that's just come out, and it looks at greenhouse gas fluxes, movements of greenhouse gases in forests specifically. And why it's interesting is that the darker the green, those forests are still carbon sinks. So they have a net sink of carbon. They sequester more than they release. And you'll see Korea is in that area. The places that are purple are now net sources of carbon. So those forests, many of the forests in Indonesia, in some of the Congo Basin forests, some of the Amazon forests, and some of the forests in Western North America and also in Russia are now, has occurred in protected areas from 2001 to 2019. So again, it's the protected areas that are really keeping us really safe from for climate change. And now, just because time's running out, I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change adaptation. I'm bringing your attention to these two reports. The one on the left is Adapting to Climate Change. It's a guideline for protected areas managers and planners. And the one on the right just came out, and it's guidelines for conserving connectivity through ecological networks and corridors. And I really see that these two come together, because when you're talking about managing your protected area for adapting to climate change, you're also needing to think about what's outside the protected area and how to connect those. When you're talking about climate change adaptation, and this is sort of a very brief summary of what's in a rather large report, you're talking about three things. One is climate refugia. So what protected areas provide is safe refugia for species that are having to adapt. Adaptive refugia. So they, in some places, protected areas with less human impact are then providing a place for species to adapt to the changing environment. And they're also providing enhanced connectivity. The protected areas are also maintaining ecosystem services. And I think what's emerged now is that resilient ecosystems are the ones that will protect us from climate change. We need resilient systems, and we need to protect all the services that they provide. Many of those are services for the well-being of people. And then the other thing you're thinking about is disaster risk reduction, maintaining the natural ecosystems that are less susceptible to climate-induced disasters and providing buffers against increased weather extremes. And this is particularly important for the blue carbon systems. This adaptation guideline has a sort of system of how you can plan, and it has goals and objectives for each stage. So I'm just going to do these very sort of quickly. The first thing is to build capacity, and I think that's what everyone's doing now. They're learning how to do spatial mapping, they're enhancing their knowledge about climate change and their knowledge about their own protected areas and areas that aren't protected but perhaps could be. Then you have to assess the climate change vulnerability, and there are some very interesting climate vulnerability indices out there, one developed by a group that works with us in our specialist group. And through that, you're looking at trying to predict the kind of impacts that climate change will have on your particular protected area. Will there be more competition for migrating species? Will you have habitat changes? Are there changes in climate variabilities? And is your protected area a potential climate refuge? So these are sort of the next step. Whoops. Why can't I go the next step? The third step is develop. So once you've got some capacity and you've assessed your vulnerability, then you develop actions. And there's a lot of different types of things you could do in this type of area. One thing is to plan at the landscape level and the seascape level to promote ecological resilience, to minimize other stressors. So for example, harvesting or tourism, making sure that your protected areas aren't stressed in ways other than climate change. Restoration is very important, and there's some very good resources on how to do this. Bringing back native species where they've been lost, connection. And then there's some more novel things that are options. If you've lost species, assisted migration. Sometimes you might have to think about novel ecosystems. Some, like where I am, we've noticed Western red cedar, which is a dominant species, is starting to die. We might have to think about the niche that species fills and whether we should be planting other species that would survive better in what is becoming very dry summers. Protecting the remaining wilderness areas and ensuring connectivity. So after that, after you've got some options, then you've got to select the ones that are most practical to implement or maybe most important to implement, developing an adaptation strategy. And then you have to mainstream that into natural climate solutions. You have to communicate your strategy, what you're doing, making sure everybody knows what to do. And then of course, always monitor, evaluate, adapt. So you're always looking at what you've done. Is it working? Is it not? How can you change it? And that report provides you with a lot of examples on what you can do in that sense. So the next part of my slide is just my talk is just a few examples. And I have about 10 minutes and I'll go through as many as I can. The first one is I'm talking about ancient forests. And this is an example that's very close to my heart because it's from where I live. So we do have very few what we call our ancient forests left. These forests store vast amounts of carbon. And in the province of British Columbia, we have only about 4,000 kilometers squared of left of unprotected high productivity ancient forests. And these store anywhere from 200 to 470 million tons of carbon. This is about 3% of what originally existed. We have other ancient forests, but most of them are at mountaintops and they don't sort of have the soil conditions and the climate conditions to produce these kinds of big trees that we think of as ancient forests here. It takes about 100 years to several hundred years to recover the carbon that's the lost carbon from logging these forests and converting them to natural forests. So I know that there's a bit of a mythology in the ecological literature that comes out of a paper from 1969 that young forests grow faster, and so they're more important for carbon sequestration. But what that forgets is, first of all, old trees do still sequester carbon. They still grow, although at a slower rate. But by cutting those old forests down, you get a release of their stored carbon, and it takes a very long time for a young forest to recover that. So you don't have a net gain from converting an old natural forest to a young forest. And I know this is all over the world, a bit of a controversial issue. And so if anybody wants to engage in a discussion on this, I'd love to maybe follow up with you. This is another example from Canada. It's called the Great Bear Rainforest. And this is an example of amazing thing that can be done when people work together. This is the largest intact coastal temperate rainforest in the world. And forest was previously approved for commercial logging. There were a lot of protests. Through negotiations, it's now one of the largest carbon offset projects in existence. It generates about 1 million tons of CO2 equivalent credits per year. And these credits are available on the commercial market, but also the government of British Columbia buys these credits. And what they're used for is to allow the 25 Indigenous groups that live in this area to have employment stewarding the forest in more conservation compatible industries. Some is tourism, some is fishing industries, all kinds of work that relates mostly to taking care of this area rather than taking the trees down. And this is another one, I won't talk about this in detail, but this is also a private protected area. And it's also bought with carbon offsets on the open market. This example is in Kenya, and this is an area that had very degraded ecosystems. The forest had been decimated, the grazing land had been overgrazed, and in 1998 they created this Rukinga Wildlife Sanctuary and expanded it over the years. It's now 202,000 hectares. It offsets 1 million tons of CO2 emissions per year for 30 years. And it was awarded the gold level status for community and biodiversity standard for exceptional biodiversity and climate benefits. So they turned around what was really a very degraded, devastated ecosystem on which people couldn't survive anymore into something that's thriving through protected area. This is an example of blue carbon in Australia. I wanted to highlight this because sometimes what you don't protect, what you don't measure. And so in the Paris Agreement, there weren't any good standards for measuring how to count blue carbon. So Australia's done a lot of work to develop that methodology so that they could count the protection of their blue carbon. They have about 20 million tons of CO2 that are absorbed annually by their seagrasses, mangroves, and salt marshes. And there's some very good papers that I could lead you to that describe this methodology, because I think many people on this call also have these blue carbon systems and would like to be able to account for them. The US West Coast also has a lot of marine protected areas, and they've been developing projects for climate adaptation in those areas. This slide is on the Congo Basin, and sort of in fairly recent years, it's been discovered that this Congo Basin is really basically it's the second biggest peatland in the world next to Indonesia. And there's a lot of intact forest in there. It stores about 30.6 billion tons of CO2 above ground and almost as much below ground. And there's a huge international effort to protect more of it because of its implications for carbon released if it's disturbed, and also because of the tremendously rich biodiversity in this area. And currently it's only about 11% formally protected. And then I won't go into details. Red Parcas, that's the Latin American Network of Protected and Conserved Areas. And they, the Latin American countries, 18 countries have got together. They have a declaration on how they can work together, and they're particularly focused on climate change, how they can maintain their above ground carbon in the Amazon, and also the below ground carbon. And in this case, about 30% is protected, but there's a lot of evidence sort of relating to what Kathy said at the beginning, that it's protected in name, but perhaps not managed well. This is a report I did for Canada, Enhancing Canada's Climate Change Ambitions. I looked at a lot of data of Canadian ecosystems, and I pulled together what would be the way that Canada could use natural climate solutions. And anybody who would like to talk about doing something like this for their own country, I'd love to talk to them about it. I came to the conclusion, at least for Canada, the best approach would be to protect our high biodiversity, carbon dense ecosystems. And then there's other recommendations in there as well. And this slide is on some of the work that Mexico is doing. Mexico's been producing, they produced a guide for developing climate change adaptation programs in Mexico's protected areas. And I think there might be some people from Mexico on the call who could help us talk about this in more detail or offline. For future directions, we want to prepare guidance for managing protected areas for climate change mitigation, a companion to the adaptation one. We want to prepare a toolkit for protected areas managers and planners that integrates all aspects of climate change, mitigation and adaptation. And I'm hoping to establish a protected area managers advisory group to advise us on what kinds of tools would actually be the most useful for you. And also we'll be developing communication products. I recently developed something called a story map, which I'd love to talk to you about. It's a really good way of communicating. And of course, we'd like to expand our membership of our specialist group to more Asian people, particularly including Korea, but other places. So if anybody's interested in working together with other people in this group, please contact me and let me know, and hopefully we can incorporate you in our group and learn together and prepare this mitigation guidelines together. Thank you. And that's my email. Don't hesitate to email if you want to. I think I'm right on time. Thanks.